The orphanage stood in the middle of the Wisconsin wilderness, its whitewashed walls glowing softly in the morning mist, an image of refuge for those who had nowhere else to go. To the townfolk, it was a place of mercy, a sanctuary for the unwanted and the abandoned, a building that promised safety and comfort where parents had failed or children had been orphaned. But inside, the air carried a different scent: dry wood, cold stone, faint antiseptic, and beneath it all a subtle undertone of fear that no visitor would notice. The caretakers moved with precise calm, their hands gentle, their eyes polite, their voices soft. But each step, each gesture was calculated to maintain the appearance of warmth while keeping a darker order intact. Children were not merely welcomed, they were examined, catalogued, and weighed, not by their cries or smiles, but by the marks they bore. Birthmarks, blemishes, crescent-shaped bruises from unknown origins, faint scars. Any mark that hinted at otherness that in the eyes of the orphanage's director could harbor misfortune or sin. The director, a quiet man with thinning hair and a habit of tapping his finger against his desk while observing, studied these signs with the intensity of a man who believed that moral corruption could manifest physically, that some children carried evil written upon their flesh. He moved among the children like a scholar in a laboratory, calm and measured, noting each freckle, each mole, each line with careful precision, marking those deemed safe for integration into the daily routine and those who required observation. Observation was a word heavy with menace, the first of many euphemisms that concealed darker truths. In the halls, nurses and attendants whispered in careful tones, reporting small details. A child who flinched too quickly, a hand that twitched, a gaze that lingered too long. These minor deviations were enough to draw attention, enough to set a chain of evaluation into motion. No one outside questioned the practices. Outsiders saw only order, cleanliness, a sense of calm. But inside, the staff moved like a hidden machine, each cog deliberate, each gear connected to the other, all turning toward the quiet orchestration of control and fear. The children themselves sensed something before they understood it, a subtle tension in the air that made their small bodies shiver at night. They felt it when the director's gaze lingered too long, cold and analyzing, when their routines were altered for minor infractions, when they were separated from friends under the guise of health checks. The director took notes meticulously, sometimes measuring the children's hands and feet, sometimes their skulls and the angle of their spines, noting their reactions with the detachment of a man conducting experiments. He moved without malice, without outward anger, and yet the effect of his presence was a slow, pervasive dread, as if every corner of the orphanage had been designed to remind children that they were not entirely safe, that their bodies could betray them, that even a mark upon the skin could decide their fate. Outside, the pine trees swayed in the wind, birds called intermittently, and the world carried on, ignorant of the patterns being traced inside. The staff carried out their daily chores with calm efficiency, feeding children, cleaning rooms, and maintaining the illusion of normalcy. And the children, trusting, obedient, unaware of the system evaluating their very existence, moved through the routines with small, hopeful hearts, never knowing that each step, each laugh, each misstep was being catalogued. In the quiet offices and hidden hallways, the director planned, mapping a sequence of acceptance and rejection, of selection and elimination, as carefully as a chess master plotting moves in a long game. The early days of 1871 were the quietest, yet already the first patterns emerged. Children singled out for reasons invisible to all but the orchestrator of the system. Those who would be kept safe and those whose lives would be quietly redirected into shadow. And so the orphanage functioned, outwardly benevolent, inwardly meticulous, a machine of kindness that concealed a mind obsessed with order, with purity, with the meticulous separation of the innocent from the marked. A mind capable of calculating who would survive and who would vanish, all behind the soft smiles of caretakers and the promise of mercy. The air remained heavy with dust and antiseptic, tinged with the unspoken, a faint hum of horror that the world refused to see, but that inside these walls dictated every breath, every touch, every heartbeat. The ledger was the heart of the orphanage, a silent authority more feared than any caretaker, more absolute than the rules that lined the walls. Each child's name was entered with deliberate precision, each letter traced carefully as if the act itself held power over the fate it recorded. Birthmarks were catalogued with painstaking detail. The shade of red or brown, the crescent or star shape, the subtle patterns that might go unnoticed by a casual observer but to the staff signaled imperfection, deviation, potential danger. Notes accompanied the physical description. How a sibling recoiled at a touch, how a mother's eyes lingered on the mark with quiet concern, how a child flinched when touched, or stared too long at the ground. These annotations were not idle. They were the beginning of judgment, a verdict passed with no trial. The head caretaker, a lean man with hollowed cheeks and unnervingly calm hands, had become obsessed with the burgeoning science of phrenology, convinced that the shape of a skull, the curve of a forehead, the angle of a jaw could reveal the soul's inclinations, the hidden moral fiber of the child within. He moved among the wards with calipers and measuring tape, recording the length of limbs, the width of shoulders, the subtle bulge of the skull, and he wrote it all in the ledger with meticulous care. The children were unaware of the silent scrutiny, but their bodies betrayed them in ways the staff had learned to read as instinctively as a doctor reading a pulse. Those marked as suspicious were quietly separated, ostensibly for medical observation, a euphemism that disguised the reality that some children would never return to the common dormitories. Their absence was noted as a matter of procedure, the ledger entries dry and factual. Yet each one carried a weight that pressed on the others, an invisible threat that made them shrink beneath blankets, hesitate before speaking, hesitate even to breathe too loudly. The act of recording became ritualistic, the pen tracing each name with calm devotion, an almost reverent acknowledgement of the authority wielded over life itself. Observers would have seen only a man working diligently, performing a tedious task with professionalism. But beneath the veneer lay a mind perfectly attuned to the slow terror of control, to the power of subtle fear. The staff mirrored this obsession in their routines. Children were bathed and dressed with attention to cleanliness and order. But at the same time, their bodies were scanned for signs of anomaly, for deviations from what the orphanage considered acceptable. Minor scratches or freckles could be elevated into markers of sin. A twitch of the hand could signal latent corruption. Punishments were dispensed with the same ritualistic care. A child singled out might be placed in isolation for hours, left to face a bare room while the others ate or played. A slow psychological pressure applied until compliance and silence became the only safe options. Some children were subjected to the most methodical of cruelties under the guise of care. Immersions in cold baths meant to strengthen the body, forced postures to correct the alignment of limbs, restricted diets designed to test resilience. Each act was measured, each response logged in the ledger, reinforcing the idea that survival depended not on courage or will, but on adherence to the invisible rules in the favor of the observer. The ledger itself became a tool of psychological torment, a reminder that each child was being watched, weighed, and judged with unflinching attention. Those who understood even partially, those who glimpsed the pattern of absences and silences, learned quickly that the only certainty in the orphanage was the meticulous, deliberate hand that moved through their lives, shaping reality according to an obsession with purity, order, and control. The director watched these processes with detached satisfaction, noting the interplay between fear and obedience, between hope and despair. The children's minds began to change subtly under the invisible influence of the ledger and the rituals it enforced. Some became silent observers themselves, recording small details, internalizing the constant judgment, whispering reassurances to themselves that they had no marks, no flaws, that they would remain unseen. Others succumbed to helpless panic, unable to reconcile the warmth they were promised with the cold attention of precise scrutiny. And in the quiet offices where the ledger rested, the head caretaker continued to write, tracing each letter with unwavering calm, weaving together physical observation, moral judgment, and ritualized oversight into a tapestry of control so thorough, so subtle, that the children themselves became instruments of the system, their fear both a reflection of the adult's obsession and a mechanism by which the obsession sustained itself. Outside, the world continued unaware, but inside, the ledger's authority governed every breath, every glance, every heartbeat. The silent arbiter of life and vanishing, of normalcy and ritualized terror. An omnipresent eye that never blinked. A machine of cruelty hidden beneath the guise of order. Beneath the orphanage, past the polished floors and the cheerful clatter of children in the day rooms, a narrow staircase led to a basement that seemed to drink the light itself. It was here, in the chamber of veins, that the carefully selected children, those whose bodies bore marks deemed unholy, were taken under the pretense of purification. The air was thick with the coppery scent of iron, mingled with the faint antiseptic odor the caretaker insisted on. A smell meant to reassure visitors that the work here was scientific, clinical, necessary. The walls were bare, cold stone, absorbing the sound of footsteps and soft whimpers, giving the space a permanence that made fear itself tangible. Children were restrained not with ordinary chains, which might suggest brutality, but with weighted cuffs attached to iron tables positioned to force limbs into unnatural angles. The restraint was methodical, deliberate, ensuring that veins swelled visibly beneath the skin like tiny rivers, exposed and vulnerable. There was no hurried cruelty here. The caretaker moved with calm precision, each gesture rehearsed, each instrument placed with the certainty of ritual. Small knives, needles, and lancets were arranged in a meticulous pattern on wooden trays, their purpose explained only to the staff and recorded in the ledger as a medical necessity. The children, forced into stillness, learned quickly that resistance only increased the pressure of the cuffs, the twist of a limb, the pounding of a vein against unyielding iron. The caretaker would begin the extraction with a slow, measured rhythm, punctuating the process with careful observation, noting the pulse, the flush of the skin, the subtle tremor that betrayed terror and pain. Blood was drawn not randomly but in specific sequences, believed to carry away corruption, to siphon the invisible stain of moral deviation from body to vessel. Each incision, each prick was performed with an almost ceremonial calm, a sequence repeated like a prayer, a litany of order imposed on chaos while the children's hearts raced in helpless terror. The act was both scientific and symbolic, the caretaker convinced that the body's fluids contained the essence of the soul, and that through disciplined extraction, evil could be purged. The sound of blood dripping into small glass vials became a haunting cadence, echoing through the basement and into the minds of those who survived to remember it. Some children passed out from the pain or the loss of warmth, and even then the caretaker's hands remained steady, noting the body's reaction with clinical detachment, as though each faltering breath were data to be recorded and understood. The survivors carried more than scars. They bore the memory of being dissected by ritual, of the slow and deliberate erosion of will. The methodical cruelty instilled a terror that extended beyond the chamber, infecting every glance at a cuffed hand, every hint of redness beneath the skin, every whisper of touch from a caretaker. Even children untouched by the instruments learned the patterns of the chamber of veins, reading the fear in their peers' eyes, internalizing the invisible laws that determined survival. Above ground, life continued with its pretense of normalcy. Meals served with warmth, lessons taught with cheer, the orphanage framed as a sanctuary of charity. But below, the heart of evil beat quietly, precisely, methodically, teaching children that the body could betray them, that the human vessel was both prison and target, that the very essence of who they were could be judged and extracted. The caretaker's mind thrived on this, drawing satisfaction not from rage or spectacle, but from the calm orchestration of pain, the psychological architecture of fear, the deliberate shaping of terror into a system that seemed on the surface invisible. Each child's reaction, each faltering breath or stifled cry became part of a growing map of behavior, a record of compliance and despair that fed the caretaker's obsession with control. When children returned above ground, eyes wide, trembling, their bodies unscarred in public but haunted in memory, they carried the invisible lesson that the ledger, the tables, the instruments, and the calm hands of authority dictated the boundaries of life and survival. The chamber of veins did not kill indiscriminately, but its methodical procedures left invisible wounds, a silent network of terror woven into the minds of children who would later struggle to name what had happened. And yet the ritual was celebrated in the caretaker's mind as purity enacted, morality enforced, science practiced with devotion. The line between science, superstition, and cruelty had been erased, leaving only the slow, rhythmic terror of veins exposed, bodies constrained, and the unrelenting certainty that survival depended on the inscrutable favor of a hidden mind, cold and omnipresent. Above the basement's iron and blood, beyond the orderly, corridors where children recited lessons and ate their meals under watchful eyes. The orphanage's attic held a space few were meant to see. Known to the staff as the mirror room, it was a chamber of quiet terror, a place where punishment and ritual converged in ways that left no visible scars but erased pieces of the mind. The walls were lined with tall mirrors, each framed in blackened wood carved with runes and backward letters, their meanings hidden to the uninitiated but etched deep into the psyche of any child forced to face them. The caretakers, with the calm precision of those who understood cruelty as art, brought the surviving children here after sessions in the Chamber of Veins, or simply when marks deemed sinful appeared under inspection. They were told that the mirrors reflected not just bodies but souls, and that the blemishes visible on skin were evidence of moral corruption. The ritual of reflection began with silence, broken only by the careful whispering of staff, voices low and measured, recounting the supposed sins that the marks betrayed, reminding children that the physical blemish was an outward sign of inner failure. One by one, they were made to stand before a mirror, often for hours, the weight of their own reflection a trap they could not escape. Those who faltered, who blinked or turned, were reminded that their hesitation revealed guilt, that their mind could betray them even when the body did not. In some cases, the punishment extended beyond a single day. Children were left alone, allowed only minimal sustenance, sometimes no water, until they repeated aloud confessions of imagined crimes, whispered transgressions, or moral failings constructed entirely by the staff. The hunger and thirst became tools of suggestion, weakening the mind's defenses, ensuring that guilt took root even in innocence. This was psychological torment, systematic and ritualistic, designed not to harm the body directly but to fracture understanding of self, leaving permanent marks on the intellect and soul. The caretaker observed each child's posture, expression, and tremor with calm, analytical detachment, noting compliance, resistance, and the subtle ways fear twisted thought. The mirrors themselves were instruments of cruelty. Etched symbols made words float backward, forcing children to strain, their eyes to water, their thoughts to contort. Each letter, each carved line was meant to imprint fear, shame, and a sense of inevitability, that sin was written on their flesh and could not be erased. Over time, the mirror room became a chamber where imagination and reality collided, where the lines between superstition, science, and punishment blurred. The children began to question themselves, to see guilt in normal acts, to fear their own reflections. Some murmured apologies for actions they could not name, confessions that satisfied neither staff nor conscience, but were recorded meticulously in ledgers alongside measurements, notes on posture, and psychological observations. The methodical cruelty was quiet but devastating, leaving survivors fragmented, distrustful of their own thoughts, trapped in a private hell constructed by unseen hands. The mastermind behind the orphanage's system moved like a conductor, orchestrating this slow psychological decay, confident that even without knives or chains, terror could be as absolute as death. Staff repeated the procedures with exacting care, ensuring that every session reinforced hierarchy and power, cementing obedience and fear while also feeding the caretaker's obsession with moral and bodily control. Outside, children walked corridors and gardens seemingly unharmed, their small faces bright with false smiles, carrying invisible wounds so deep that only memory and nightmares betrayed the horror above. Some learned to avoid mirrors entirely, covering their eyes or fleeing to corners, behaviors rewarded or punished in cycles that reinforced the invisible authority of the room. The psychological structure of the altar of reflection taught them to internalize blame, to mistrust instinct and emotion, to see moral corruption as a tangible, controllable entity that could be measured, observed, and punished. Each child left the room altered, the imprint of ritual on mind and heart as real as any scar from a blade. The experience in the mirror room followed a pattern, one step in the carefully calculated design of the orphanage. First, the observation, then the extraction of blood, then the internalization of guilt. The rooms above, the meals, the cheerful instruction, and the songs of other children all became part of a theater of normalcy that masked the ongoing work of a hidden mind shaping lives with quiet omnipotence. The altar of reflection was a crucible of thought and fear where innocence was systematically fractured and reconstructed to conform to the caretaker's vision of morality and ritual. The children learned that suffering could exist without visible evidence, that terror could be absolute even when unobserved, and that survival meant obeying not just external authority, but the internalized commands of a mind that wielded guilt and superstition with deliberate artistry. It was an education in submission, a cruel curriculum that taught the next step of obedience. The acceptance of the unnatural as natural, of evil dressed as care, of horror hidden behind the ordinary, preparing them for the next chapter in the orphanage's hidden life, where the boundaries of cruelty would continue to expand and the mind itself became the battleground for survival. The quietest horrors were often the most absolute, and in the orphanage they unfolded in the spaces no one noticed, in methods designed to erase not bodies but minds. Some children vanished from the visible world without a trace, leaving behind only faint markers, cryptic and ritualistic, as if the house itself remembered what had transpired. A small cross, carved into the splintered edge of a door frame, faintly etched but unmistakable to those who knew its meaning, marked the passage of one child from ordinary existence into an invisible torment. On the floor, chalk lines formed obscure geometric patterns, the shapes precise, deliberate, repeated until the pigment smudged into the dust, whispering secrets no one outside could understand. Diaries written by trembling hands contained songs repeated backward, words twisted into echoes of guilt and fear, as if the child's mind had been caught in a loop of moral reflection and self-punishment. These children, marked and selected long before, had become instruments for a caretaker whose obsession with silence, absence, and internalized terror exceeded even the darkest Victorian superstitions. The silent choir, as it came to be called in later accounts, was not a room or a single ritual, but a systematic method for dissolving thought, reshaping perception and bending reality to the will of a mind that measured evil not in blood but in obedience, fear, and hallucination. The caretaker had discovered the power of absence, how the unspoken could weigh heavier than chains, how isolation could become an echo chamber in which the child's own imagination became the prosecutor, jury, and executioner. Small, soundproofed closets built behind panels that fit seamlessly into the walls became instruments of psychological decay. Inside, the air was damp, the temperature uneven, time a concept untethered. Children were left hours, then days, without the comforting hum of life outside, forced to confront their own thoughts, to imagine threats lurking beyond the thin boards of their prison. When repetition was introduced, the punishment became an almost sacred cruelty. Children moved their hands or feet in precise patterns, mimicking invisible signals, a choreography dictated by the caretaker and designed to preoccupy the mind, stave off imagined specters, and break any sense of internal order. The combination of isolation and repetitive ritual stripped away the ordinary markers of reality, creating hallucinations that were entirely self-generated but perfectly orchestrated by the orphanage's hidden methods. Family members appeared in visions, accusing eyes in shadows, whispers of imagined sins forming a chorus that could not be silenced. Sleep was a forbidden indulgence. When the caretaker allowed rest, it came only in fragmented, uneven intervals, a few minutes at a time, until exhaustion itself became an agent of submission. Over weeks, children could not distinguish between day and night, between memory and hallucination, between love and accusation. The mind, stripped of normal reference points, internalized guilt and fear as inexorably as the body internalized food or air. The recordings in the orphanage's ledgers reflected the precision of this cruelty. Notes documented the duration of isolation, the pattern and number of movements repeated, the cadence of songs or prayers performed backward, and most chillingly, the responses of children to their own imaginings. Some children laughed quietly at shadows no one else could see, or muttered apologies to parents long dead or absent, believing in crimes that had never occurred. These observations were filed with the same clinical detachment applied to measurements of bones, birthmarks, and blood vessels. Evidence that the mind itself could be mapped, controlled, and punished as methodically as flesh. The silent choir was not an act of visible violence, but it produced devastation that echoed through the psyche long after the child returned to the ostensibly normal spaces of the orphanage. The fear and guilt were cumulative, layering upon each other like sediment, compacted into corners of thought that could be excavated only in nightmares or compulsive behaviors. The caretaker observed the results with a detached, almost scientific curiosity, cataloging each child's mental fracture, each lapse of resistance, each self-imposed confession as proof of the efficacy of this system. There was no scream, no blood, no bruise that would invite prosecution or pity. Yet the damage was absolute, a silent architecture of cruelty that left minds in ruins. When children rejoined communal spaces, they carried invisible scars, moving with hesitancy, voices quieted by internalized fear, eyes alert for threats that existed only in memory or imagination. And yet the caretaker's methods did not rely on punishment alone. They relied on suggestion, on a subtle mastery of expectation, creating a world in which children became complicit in their own suffering. They feared the consequences of thought, of imagination, of memory itself. The evil of the orphanage manifested not in overt brutality, but in the manipulation of perception, in the conversion of time, space, and silence into instruments of control. The silent choir exemplified the unique terror of a mind capable of calculating horror in a way that left no physical evidence but destroyed lives in a methodical, unstoppable way. It was a symphony of absence, a music composed of isolation, repetition, and hallucination, and those who survived carried its rhythms forever, their own minds forever attuned to the rhythms of terror imposed by a hidden, omnipotent intelligence that smiled in plain sight. In the orphanage, the greatest harm was not inflicted with tools or instruments, but through the invisible hand of psychological domination, and the silent choir was the cruelest testament to the artistry of a mind that measured evil with precision, patience, and a terrifying, relentless calm. The orphanage's dining hall was a stage for a terror carefully disguised as civility, where the act of eating became an instrument of methodical cruelty. Long tables stretched beneath dim gaslights, polished surfaces reflecting the faces of children seated in rows, their small hands clasped in quiet obedience, their eyes uncertain, knowing that the very act of nourishment could be a vehicle for suffering. The caretaker presided silently, an unremarkable figure in plain clothing, a benign presence that concealed a mind consumed by obsession, ritual, and control. Every motion, every glance was measured with forensic attention, cataloging minute changes in color, posture, or expression as if the children themselves were specimens in a private laboratory. Those labeled corrupted, the ones whose birthmarks, postures, or small tics had been judged indicators of hidden sin or moral frailty, were subjected to a feast that was no feast at all, but a meticulously orchestrated series of punishments executed under the guise of sustenance. Food was not simply prepared, it was weaponized. Each dish contained irritants carefully chosen to provoke vomiting, burning sensations, or hallucinations, each reaction recorded in the ledger with precise detail, noting the speed of onset, the severity of distress, and the child's attempts to conceal or withstand it. Some were given bitter herbs, their flavors harsh and lingering, said to extract evil from the body, an archaic belief drawn from a blend of spiritualism and pseudo-medical theory, yet administered in ways that left the body writhing, the nerves tense, the stomach convulsing as if the very act of digestion had been converted into a ritual of terror. Others were served bland, innocuous-looking meals, yet the psychological torment began as soon as they were seated. Fear was as palpable as the scent of overcooked porridge, a silent pressure bearing down on each child, knowing that any misstep, any hesitation, any expression of discomfort could invite observation, reprimand, or the next stage of ritualized punishment. The caretaker observed all with the calm precision of a surgeon, noting the twitch of an eye, the tremor in a hand, the way a child tried to suppress retching while another's face turned a shade too pale. In some cases, children convulsed under the influence of stress, not from the food itself, but from the anticipation of the next measure of torment, their bodies betraying their fear even as their minds attempted to cling to the rules of obedience. The meals became a choreography of cruelty, a combination of chemical, physical, and psychological manipulation, each element designed to provoke suffering while maintaining the appearance of ritualized propriety. Children ate with trembling hands, eyes darting to the silent figure at the head of the table, aware that their survival required a careful negotiation between restraint and involuntary reaction, between hiding pain and revealing it enough to satisfy the unspoken ritual. By the time the meal concluded, some children were paralyzed with fear, unable to move, their thoughts trapped in the memory of nausea, pain, and humiliation. Others bore permanent marks, subtle and indelible. Trembling hands that would not still, stomachs that refused comfort, faces that would not betray trust. Minds forever echoing with the rhythm of ritual, the cadence of control, the silent assertion of dominance. Yet the caretaker's cruelty extended beyond the immediate suffering of the body. It penetrated the psyche, turning meals into lessons in obedience and terror, conditioning children to associate nourishment with pain, trust with danger, normalcy with dread. The ledger recorded each instance, the handwriting precise, calm, almost clinical, translating chaos into order, suffering into knowledge, human agony into a methodical experiment. Over time, the hall itself became a symbol, a space where children internalized the rules of fear, learned the architecture of punishment, and anticipated the invisible hand of authority in every act of daily life. The shadows under the table seemed longer, the candlelight colder, the air thick with anticipation and latent panic. The ritual was not a single act, but a series of carefully staged provocations, each one escalating the psychological terror, each one reinforcing the omnipresence of control. The children who survived carried the feast in memory long after the plates were cleared. The taste of bitter herbs, the memory of convulsing stomachs, the sight of peers silently writhing beside them. The quiet, unwavering observation of the caretaker, whose eyes cataloged everything without emotion, without comment, without the slightest sign of sympathy. It was a demonstration of a mind hidden behind innocence, a mind that could orchestrate agony in plain sight while maintaining the mask of civility, generosity, and religious propriety. Every bite, every tremor, every scream, restrained or released, was part of a methodical sequence, a ritual designed to shape not just bodies but souls, bending them into compliance, breaking them into fear, and reshaping their perception of safety and danger. By the end of the meal, the hall was quiet except for the low, barely audible groans of children whose bodies and minds had been tested, measured, and altered. The shadows deepened by candlelight, the air still vibrating with the invisible marks of torment. The feast of shadows, though masked as nourishment, was in truth a meticulous symphony of horror, a testament to the systematic cruelty of a mind that understood that control could be absolute, that suffering could be precise, and that terror, when administered with care and observation, could last far longer than any visible scar. The ritual was complete, the children's submission recorded in ledger and memory alike, each act of pain a building block in a larger design that was invisible to the world, yet absolute in its effect. The orphanage's corridors held a silence that was almost alive, a stillness so complete it pressed against the eardrums, filling every empty space with the invisible weight of anticipation. Children who vanished from the common rooms left no trace of struggle, no screams echoing down the hallways, only faint ritualistic marks. A small cross carved meticulously into the corner of a doorframe, a series of strange symbols drawn in chalk on a floor that would soon be swept clean, a diary entry inked backwards, a song repeated in reverse until its meaning twisted into confusion and guilt. These signs were not merely decoration. They were a language of fear, a record of the caretaker's influence, a subtle breadcrumb trail of control that left survivors trembling at the thought of what had been taken and why. The caretaker, a figure whose calm demeanor and unremarkable appearance concealed a mind honed to predatory precision, had become fascinated with the power of silence. To him, noise was rebellion, laughter a contagion, and the absence of sound a canvas upon which he could project absolute authority. In pursuit of this obsession, he devised methods that were simple in appearance yet devastating in effect. Children were placed in small, soundproofed closets, spaces so enclosed that the ordinary markers of time, voices, footsteps, the distant clang of dishes, were erased. Hours stretched into days, days into infinite loops of monotony until children's minds began to lose their connection to reality. They counted tiles and cracks, muttered prayers under their breath, recited memorized verses, and eventually even these anchors dissolved into hallucination. Repetition became a weapon. The simple act of moving hands or feet in patterns dictated by the caretaker's unseen authority, a survival strategy against imagined specters that flickered at the edges of consciousness. Each child internalized the rules quickly. The silence was punishment, but the ritualized motion, the repetition, could stave off further torment. Yet even these measures only postponed the inevitable breakdown. Sleep deprivation compounded the effect, transforming imagination into accusation. The caretaker had learned through observation and the study of emerging psychological experiments that the human mind could be made to punish itself if properly constrained. The children began to see faces of family members, friends, even themselves, accusing, scolding, judging, whispering of sins they had never committed. Every heartbeat became a countdown, every blink an acknowledgement of guilt, every breath a measure of impending judgment. The punishment was invisible yet absolute. It left no marks on the skin, yet scarred the mind in ways far more enduring than any physical injury. The orphanage itself became a mechanism of thought control, its walls a mirror of the caretaker's meticulous cruelty, its shadows stretched thin with the tension of anticipation. Some children, removed from view entirely, existed only as extensions of his study. Their minds observed in subtle ways, a scratch of chalk on a wall, a faint song hummed in the dark, a rhythm of motion repeated until the body itself became a ritual object, a vessel for his experimental terror. The silent choir, as it became known among those who later survived to speak of it, was a symphony of absence. The empty spaces of the orphanage were filled with the echoes of suppressed voices, the hallucinated whispers of imagined relatives, the trembling of bodies trained to respond to invisible commands. By the time children were returned, often hours or days later, they were hollowed, their perception of reality fragmented, their fear internalized. They no longer feared the caretaker's hand or his words alone. They feared their own thoughts, their own imagination, their own reflexes trained to betray them at any moment. Some attempted to speak of what they had endured, but the nature of the punishment rendered testimony unreliable. Memories of time in the closets were circular, fragmented, distorted by the relentless repetition of gestures, the imposition of silence, and the hallucinations that had been encouraged to blossom unchecked. Even the few who retained fragments of clarity were forever altered. They flinched at shadows, anticipated judgment where none existed, and repeated their own rituals, unknowingly perpetuating the caretaker's methods long after he was gone. The evil of the orphanage and the silent choir was subtle, intangible, and nearly impossible to prosecute. There were no bruises to photograph, no broken bones to examine, no immediate proof of the invisible terror that had passed through the hallways. The caretaker had weaponized the mind itself, proving that suffering need not be overt to be devastating, that control could be exercised through absence, through anticipation, through the very structure of perception. In the corners of the hallways, the marks remained for a time, a cross, a pattern, a line of backward script. They were small, almost forgotten, yet they spoke to a larger design, a calculated pattern of psychological terror. The silent choir was not merely a method of punishment, it was a method of transformation, shaping children into shadows of themselves, minds disciplined through fear, bodies constrained by anticipation, and spirits bound by the invisible threads of observation. By the end of the ritual, the children who emerged were altered irrevocably. They carried the echoes of accusation, the reflexive responses to imagined threats, the internalized guilt, and the memory of endless silence. Even the caretaker, in his cold reflection, recognized a quiet triumph. The mind could be broken with a subtlety more enduring than any lash, more permanent than any wound, more absolute than any outward violence. Each child became both victim and instrument, a part of the ongoing experiment, a note in a choir that had never sung aloud, a testament to the terrifying precision of a mind that understood terror not as spectacle, but as methodical, intimate, and entirely psychological. Outside the walls of the orphanage, the garden stretched like a painted illusion, a landscape meant to soothe the eye, yet designed to manipulate the mind. To any casual visitor, it was an orderly expanse of blooms, neat rows of marigolds, lavender, and roses, their colors vibrant and fragrant under the soft sunlight. Yet beneath this veneer of pastoral care, the soil concealed an entirely different purpose, one far darker than any outsider could imagine. Children selected for their perceived failings were forced into shallow graves dug among the flower beds, their small bodies pressed against the cool earth while the caretaker observed with clinical detachment. Some were blindfolded, ears straining for sound but receiving only the muted whispers of nature and the distant rustle of petals. Others were left to watch, their eyes fixed on peers being punished above ground. The movements controlled, ritualistic, as though every gesture were being choreographed for the precise effect of terror. The cries of the buried or the restrained were stifled by design. The caretaker had learned that silence amplified the mind's response to fear, that the imagination could be sharpened into a weapon when sensation was restrained or denied. Above the ground, flowers were not merely planted. They were arranged with meticulous precision, forming letters, patterns, even tiny crosses that memorialized the suffering beneath them. A secret language of pain hidden in the guise of beauty. Each blossom became a witness, each leaf a participant in a ritual where terror and aesthetics intertwined, where the caretaker's mind projected order and control onto both living and buried bodies. The garden became a ledger of obedience and endurance, a record that was unreadable to outsiders but perfectly understood by the one who orchestrated it. Here, compliance was measured not by words but by how still the buried bodies remained, how the children above ground refrained from screams, how subtle shifts in posture betrayed fear or defiance. Time lost all ordinary meaning within the rows of flowers. Hours passed without markers, the sun arcing across the sky while small bodies felt the press of soil, the tension of eyes upon them, and the constant watchful attention of the caretaker. Shadows lengthened and contracted across petals, counting out minutes that the children could not measure. Some hallucinated. Petals bloomed and receded in unnatural rhythms. Flower scents became choking perfumes, and whispers of long-dead relatives accused them of sins they had never committed. The garden was no longer merely a physical space. It became a theater of the mind, a crucible in which the psyche itself was molded through anticipation, observation, and the internalization of fear. The caretaker's obsession with ritual and appearance extended beyond mere observation. He cataloged reactions, noting trembling fingers, widened eyes, subtle tics, and the precise moments when a child's resistance faltered. He arranged flowers over disturbed soil to encode these observations, each arrangement a message of victory or failure, compliance or defiance. No child's suffering went unrecorded, and every petal and cross became part of a cumulative experiment in terror. Some children, buried blindfolded, emerged hours later with eyes wide and minds frayed, unable to distinguish soil from air, reality from hallucination. Others, forced to witness, carried the guilt of survival, the weight of observation, the terror of powerlessness etched into their memory. Fear became habitual, obedience instinctive, and the line between punishment and education blurred into irrelevance. The garden, in its serene appearance, was a perverse archive of cruelty, its blooms and rose a ledger impossible to read without intimate knowledge of its dark logic. And yet the caretaker derived satisfaction not only from the pain inflicted, but from the order of it, the aesthetic perfection of ritualized terror. The idea that suffering could be orchestrated with beauty as its framework. Each child's reaction, each twitch of a limb, each flicker of fear was catalogued in his mind, folded into a pattern that extended beyond individual experience into a larger vision of control. The act of burial, the enforced observation, the silent endurance, all combined to make each child both witness and victim, both participant and object in the caretaker's ongoing study. In this garden, death and life, soil and flower, silence and observation all converged into a singular methodical expression of power. Children emerged from the earth pale, trembling, eyes wide with the residual echo of terror. Their bodies and minds having been recorded in the invisible ledger of the caretaker's mind. Those who survived the garden carried with them not only memory but a conditioned response, the anticipation of suffering, the habit of obedience, the instinct to internalize fear and transform it into compliance. Even the flowers, vibrant and alive, were tainted with the memory of soil turned human. Petals pressed down by small hands, roots disturbed by trembling fingers. The garden was a map of the orphanage's cruelty, a network of observation and ritual that marked every step, every motion, every heartbeat of those subjected to it. And in the caretaker's calm reflection, he saw a world perfected, terror administered with the precision of a hand that understood the interplay of mind and body, of beauty and horror, of ritual and response. The Garden of Eyes was complete, a silent, watchful record of suffering, and every blossom, every cross, every disturbed clod of earth bore witness to a methodical cruelty that would haunt those who survived it for the rest of their lives. shaping not only bodies but the very architecture of thought itself. In the shadowed corners of the orphanage, where light fell unevenly across cracked floors and faded wallpaper, the caretaker introduced a ritual that would etch terror into memory without leaving obvious marks. The confessor's needle. Children designated as the most stubborn, the most corrupted, were summoned individually into a narrow chamber, its walls lined with the subtle scent of antiseptic and herbs, a mixture meant to calm yet disorient at the same time. The air itself seemed measured, regulated, as though each molecule had been calculated to heighten anxiety. Upon entering, the child would find a series of ultra-fine steel needles meticulously arranged on a tray, each one positioned according to the caretaker's private code. A sequence of points along the spine, hands, and temples that mirrored diagrams drawn from 19th century medical journals, combined with patterns derived from ritual scarification he had studied in distant cultures. The child was compelled to kneel, to extend limbs to position their head so that the needles could pierce with unerring precision. Pain began subtly, almost imperceptibly at first, a prickle that became fire as the needle entered beneath the skin. Some were heated, coaxing invisible burns into nerves, creating an internal agony that could be traced through the body without leaving a single external mark. Each insertion was accompanied by a command. The recitation of confessions, the naming of sins, the recounting of imagined moral failings, whispered aloud so that every syllable could be monitored for tone, tremor, or hesitation. The caretaker observed with clinical devotion, noting micro-expressions, changes in breathing, the tremor of lips, the tension in fingers. He cataloged every reaction, every flicker of resistance, as if each child were both subject and instrument in an ongoing study of fear and submission. The ritual was slow, unrelenting, designed to break down the mind while maintaining an illusion of order. Hours might pass, each moment punctuated by the careful placement of needles, the subtle adjustments of heated steel, the insistence on confession, and the relentless gaze of the orchestrator. In some cases, the children experienced hallucinations of punishment or judgment, their nerves translating the internal burns into visions of family members condemning them, shadows whispering accusations that they had not committed. The combination of physical agony and psychological torment transformed each session into a private crucible, a place where the mind became both the battleground and the weapon. Despite the absence of visible injury, the consequences were enduring. Children emerged pale, trembling, bodies twitching as nerves misfired from the internal trauma, minds rattled by the enforced confession and the ritualized pain that accompanied it. Some could no longer distinguish imagined wrongdoing from reality. Guilt became habitual, obedience instinctive, and fear a companion as constant as their own heartbeat. The caretaker, for his part, derived satisfaction not only from the torment itself, but from the perfection of its administration. Each needle was positioned according to a methodical logic, each confession timed to elicit maximum physiological response. Each reaction recorded in private journals that cataloged endurance, compliance, and defiance with forensic precision. In this room, cruelty was executed as if it were science, ritual, and art simultaneously. A blend designed to manipulate the psyche as much as the body. Even the children who survived repeated sessions carried marks invisible to the eye but indelibly inscribed in the architecture of their minds. Sleep became fitful. Dreams haunted by burning sensations and whispered accusations. The memory of precise placements replaying in involuntary tremors or flinches at the faintest pressure along their spines or temples. The ritual reinforced the orphanage's central doctrine. The mind could be reshaped through fear, the body could be disciplined without scars, and obedience could be sculpted from terror itself. The confessor's needle was a secret ledger of cruelty, a permanent testament to the caretaker's methodical mastery. Yet it existed entirely beyond the scrutiny of law or morality. Parents, neighbors, and visitors saw only civility, charity, the routine of orphanage life, completely unaware that beneath the veneer of care, precision torment had become a systematic practice. It was a place where silence, observation, and ritualized pain intertwined, where the subtle manipulation of nerves and conscience ensured that every child knew fear, shame, and obedience as intimately as their own pulse. The historical inspiration for the practice, drawn from forgotten experiments in neurology and distant scarification rituals, was irrelevant to the children subjected to it. For them, the confessor's needle was not academic, not cultural, not theoretical. It was immediate, absolute, and unescapable. The psychological toll rippled outward. Peers observed the aftermath with a mixture of terror and enforced curiosity. Learning to anticipate punishment, internalizing rules not from instruction but from witnessing the precise cruelty of the ritual. The caretaker's mind remained inscrutable, his civility intact before outsiders, his obsession hidden beneath manners, care, and devotion to order. But within the small, narrow chamber, his genius for methodical cruelty was fully realized, each session producing results that were invisible, enduring, and devastating. The confessor's needle was more than punishment. It was transformation, the shaping of body and mind into instruments of fear, the assertion of absolute control by one who had mastered the art of suffering without leaving evidence. A ritual that etched terror so deeply that memory itself became a permanent witness. Every placement, every heated burn, every enforced confession contributed to the meticulous ledger of cruelty, a testament to an evil that hid in plain sight, a mind whose methodical perfection elevated torture into a silent, unprovable, and psychologically irreversible art. Decades passed, and the orphanage, once bustling with the superficial hum of innocence and care, had been reduced to shadows and dust. Its corridors long emptied of the small feet and whispered cries that had once animated its rooms. The world outside had forgotten, or perhaps chosen to forget, the subtle horrors conducted within its walls. It was only when a journalist, drawn by the faint rumor of hidden archives, forced open a rusted lock on a sealed chamber beneath the main building that the ledger was revealed. A collection of brittle pages, ink faded but legible, bound by hand and meticulously organized. The first glance suggested the appearance of ordinary records, names of children, dates of admission, notes on behavior and performance. But as the journalist turned page after page, a pattern emerged, an invisible architecture of cruelty, deliberate and precise, mapped across decades. Each entry described punishments with the sterile clarity of a medical case study, chronicling meals laced with irritants, hours of enforced immobility, The precise application of needles along spines and temples, and the rituals of fear imposed with unwavering discipline. Deaths once assumed to be accidents or illness were now revealed as the inevitable conclusions of meticulously orchestrated torment. A choreography of agony that transformed suffering into a system of power. Names recurred across years. Children moved through cycles of punishment and ritual until their bodies and minds were exhausted beyond resistance. Dates aligned with hospital reports and coroner notes previously dismissed as coincidence, but here, side by side with the caretaker's own notations, they formed a lattice of intent, showing that every injury, every convulsion, every hallucination had been anticipated, measured, and catalogued. The ledger was not merely a record, it was an expression of a philosophy, a worldview in which suffering was evidence, confession was currency, and the mind itself was both instrument and audience. Marginalia hinted at the caretaker's obsession with moral extraction, the notion that fear could be harvested, internalized, and transformed into a kind of discipline, invisible yet permanent, that bound the children to obedience even after escape or death. Historical medical practices, some long abandoned, were interwoven with superstition and ritual, a synthesis that allowed cruelty to masquerade as care. The journalist's hands trembled as the ledger described a sequence of events previously recorded as coincidences in local newspapers. Children discovered missing, faint symbols scratched into walls or floors, cryptic songs repeated in diaries, all now revealed as deliberate acts in a larger design. Each page radiated the meticulous mind behind it, a mind that hid behind civility and charity, cloaking obsession in the ordinary rhythms of orphanage life. The entries detailed the incremental escalation of punishment, meals that induced vomiting and hallucinations, isolation in soundproofed closets until the perception of time itself became an instrument of terror, forced observation of peers enduring pain while the observer remained powerless to intervene. The ledger quantified endurance, catalogued resistance, and marked compliance, the handwriting itself coldly impersonal yet betraying a faint flourish that hinted at aesthetic consideration. A flourish that suggested the caretaker derived satisfaction not only from the act of punishment, but from the precise execution and enduring psychological imprint. As the journalist turned further, passages revealed ritualized deaths, their descriptions clinical yet detailed in ways that made the horror immediate. The exact positioning of a child's body, the timing of administered herbs or heated needles, the subtle cues that ensured maximum fear and maximum obedience before the final irreversible act. It became evident that the orphanage's evil was designed to be invisible, sustainable, and self-perpetuating. Children were disciplined in ways that would mark them for life, survivors carrying internalized terror that could be triggered by ordinary circumstance, ensuring that fear itself became a lasting legacy. The ledger, in essence, was a map of a psyche that had mastered cruelty as a language, communicating through suffering and control. Society, long removed from the immediate horror, began to grasp the scale of what had occurred only when the journalist's findings were published, forcing coroners, historians, and the public to confront the meticulous nature of the evil that had flourished behind the facade of care. Each diary entry, medical annotation, and ledger note testified to a mind methodical in its obsession, one that believed in silent judgment as a moral imperative, in invisible fear as a tool of education, in death as the ultimate statement of control. The horror of the orphanage was no longer confined to rumor or rumor's residue. It had been rendered undeniable by its own meticulous record-keeping. The ledger illuminated the systematic blending of historical experimentation, psychological manipulation, and ritualistic belief, showing that the caretaker's obsession had been philosophical as well as practical. A doctrine of suffering as governance, of terror as instruction, of the mind itself as a canvas for cruelty. The children, some long deceased, some surviving with fractured memories, became names, dates, and patterns. The ledger transforming individual tragedy into a comprehensible, horrifying system. Those who read it felt the weight of the methodical horror, a realization that behind every act of benevolence and order lay the calculated imposition of terror, measured not by compassion but by control. In this archive, decades of suffering, compliance, and fear were no longer invisible. Each line, each annotation, each cryptic mark chronicled not merely acts of punishment but the unfolding philosophy of a mind that believed in the perfection of cruelty, in the meticulous orchestration of human vulnerability, and in the enduring power of unseen fear. The ledger, finally unveiled, forced society to reconcile with the reality that evil could be methodical, hidden behind civility, and executed with such precision that even death itself became a deliberate instrument. Every entry a testament to a perverse genius for control that had shaped countless lives, left scars in memory where none were visible on the body, and illuminated the full, calculated horror of the orphanage for the first time in decades. The orphanage, once a place of apparent care, had long since been emptied of its children, its halls silent, its walls scarred by secrets no one dared fully name. Yet its influence lingered, reverberating far beyond the decaying bricks and overgrown gardens, shaping laws and practices in Wisconsin for decades. Inspectors and social workers, long after the building had closed, walked the state's corridors with a wary reverence, compelled by reports of ritualized suffering, vanished children, and the ledger that chronicled cruelty with a precision that was almost scientific. Child protection reforms were enacted, demanding not just occasional oversight but a system of checks designed to uncover what had been hidden for so long. Mandatory reporting became the law, inspections became ritualized in their own right, and orphanages, boarding schools, and care institutions were forced to submit to scrutiny once unimaginable in scope. Yet even as regulations multiplied, memorials were established where unmarked graves had been discovered, their placards silent testimony to lives erased, to horror rendered invisible for generations. Flowers were placed, candles lit, ceremonies held to remember the dead and to mark a society's attempt to reconcile with what had been done. But these acts, while solemn and necessary, could not fully capture the depth of suffering, nor the intellectual precision of the mind that had orchestrated it. The caretaker's genius for hidden cruelty, the ability to mask obsession beneath the veneer of civility, had not been tamed by law or memory. Psychologists and historians debated, poring over ledger entries and survivor testimony, attempting to articulate what made a mind capable of such methodical evil. Was it ideology, madness, or a meticulous philosophy of pain that sought to shape souls rather than simply destroy bodies? Each theory only deepened the unease, for the patterns revealed in those brittle pages suggested that malevolence could hide in plain sight, flourish behind bureaucratic normalcy, and evade detection for years until the accumulation of evidence, the patient unearthing of diaries, coroner notes, and ritualized symbols finally exposed it. Survivors carried invisible scars, the echo of ritual punishments replaying in dreams, the taste of fear lingering decades later in their waking lives. They spoke rarely, haunted by confessions forced and imagined, by time spent in darkness, in silence, in the careful observation of peers suffering. The ledger had captured not just acts but philosophies, a mind obsessed with silent judgment and the extraction of moral terror. A mind that believed in the perpetuation of fear as both art and authority. Society could legislate, memorialize, and educate, yet no law could fully anticipate the subtlety with which such cruelty could operate again. Nor could any monument fully convey the psychological architecture of suffering left behind. Academics debated the plausibility of recurrence, asking whether institutional systems, human oversight, and societal complacency might once again allow a mind such as the caretaker's to take root, hidden beneath ordinary routines and benevolent facades. The legacy of the orphanage was therefore twofold, procedural and philosophical. A lesson written not only in statutes and investigations but in the enduring question of human awareness. It was procedural in the sense that it had forced reform, inspired vigilance, and demanded accountability. It was philosophical in the sense that it exposed the fragility of perception, the ease with which horror could nestle inside civility, and the intellectual cunning that allowed a single individual to manipulate fear, silence, and obedience over many years. The memorials stood as silent witnesses, yet their stillness was deceptive, hinting at horrors that remained unquantifiable, lives unrecorded, and minds irreparably scarred. Those who studied the orphanage's history understood that the most terrifying element was not the acts themselves, brutal and methodical though they were, but the invisible logic behind them, the rationality of cruelty concealed in routine, in kindness, in the appearance of care. The caretaker's mind had been a machine for suffering, and while the machine had been dismantled by discovery and reform, its design was now preserved in history, a warning etched in ledger pages, legal codes, and memory. As the documentary reaches its conclusion, it does so with a weighty, almost oppressive reflection. Societies may legislate against cruelty, scholars may analyze its mechanics, memorials may honor the dead, but the capacity for methodical evil hidden in plain sight persists as an enduring question. Silence, complacency, and trust in normalcy could allow it to flourish again, and perhaps always had the potential to do so. In the quiet aftermath, the camera lingers not on the bricks, the flowers, or the plaques, but on the space left by absence, on the invisible architecture of fear, on the empty rooms that once contained lives transformed into instruments of observation and suffering. The ledger may have been unveiled, the graves may have been marked, yet the lesson is far from concluded. Horror can exist behind civility, cruelty can masquerade as care, and the mind that orchestrates suffering with patient ritualistic precision can remain unseen until it chooses otherwise. The documentary closes with a final solemn reflection that reaches beyond the orphanage, beyond Wisconsin, beyond the ledger itself. The legacy of silence remains a philosophical as well as procedural caution. It asks of the viewer not just remembrance, but vigilance. Not just empathy, but awareness, leaving the enduring challenge hanging in the air, unspoken yet profoundly felt. What do you think? Could this happen again?